The Library of Alexandria held 500,000 ancient texts. When it burned, humanity lost knowledge will never recover. But what secrets were really inside? This is the greatest tragedy in human history. There are places where knowledge goes to die, where the accumulated wisdom of civilizations, mathematics that could split the atom, medicines that could cure plagues, philosophies that could reshape empires, simply vanishes. Alexandria. The 331 BCE. The city rose from Mediterranean sand like a fever dream. Built by a conqueror who believed immortality lived not in the body, but in the permanence of recorded thought. Alexander the Great died young. His empire fractured. But his library was supposed to last forever. Can you smell it? That particular scent of aging papyrus. Sweet, dusty, tinged with the salt air of the harbor. 700,000 scrolls. The entire known world, captured in ink and reed. Mathematicians from Athens. Astronomers from Babylon. Physicians from Persia. They came with trembling hands and precious cargo, their life's work bundled in leather cases, desperate to be copied, preserved, immortalized within those walls. The great library wasn't just a building. It was a promise. That human thought mattered enough to protect. That knowledge could transcend death, conquest, the erosion of time itself. That somewhere, somehow, the answers would be waiting, untouched, pristine, eternal. But promises made to history have a way of rotting. The scribes worked by oil lamp. Their fingers stained permanent black from squid ink. They copied everything. The treatises on hydraulic engineering. Lost plays of Sophocles. Medical texts describing surgeries we wouldn't attempt again for 2,000 years. Maps of continents not yet discovered. Ars calculations proving the Earth was round centuries before Columbus was born. Every ship that entered Alexandria's harbor was searched, not for weapons or contraband, but for books. Seized, copied, sometimes returned, often kept. The library grew fat on intellectual theft, gorging itself on humanity's collective memory. And then, can you hear it? That absence. That terrible, suffocating silence where something vast once stood. Between 48 BCE and 642 CE, across 6 centuries of chaos, the Library of Alexandria died. Not in a single apocalyptic moment, but slowly, repeatedly, across multiple catastrophes, each more devastating than the last. Julius Caesar, Christian mobs, Muslim conquest, accident, ideology, ignorance, or something worse. Because here's what keeps scholars awake, staring at fragmentary texts and contradictory accounts, feeling the weight of what was lost pressing against their chests like a physical presence. What if it wasn't destroyed by accident at all? What if someone, multiple someones across centuries, looked at the accumulated knowledge of the ancient world and decided it needed to burn? '48 BCE, Julius Caesar stands in Alexandria's harbor, watching his own ships burn. He ordered it, a desperate military tactic, setting fire to enemy vessels to prevent their use. But fire doesn't respect intention. It spreads. It leaps. It hungers. The flames reach the waterfront warehouses. Inside 40,000 scrolls. The air turned thick with burning papyrus. A smell witnesses described as sweet and poisonous, like burning honey mixed with something deeply wrong. Scholars rushed from the main library building, their robes catching embers, their hands grasping at floating ash that had been moments before irreplaceable mathematics. One account describes an astronomer named Theon collapsing on the marble steps. Not from burns. From grief. His life's work, calculations of planetary motion, so precise they wouldn't be matched until Copernicus, existed in a single copy. He watched it become smoke. He watched centuries of star mapping, of patient observation, of cosmic understanding, dissolve into the Mediterranean wind. Caesar barely mentioned it in his writings. A footnote. A regrettable accident. Collateral damage in the machinery of empire. But the scribes knew. You could see it in how they worked afterward. Faster. More frantic. Making multiple copies of everything. Hiding duplicates in private collections. In provincial libraries. In the homes of wealthy patrons who might shield them from the next catastrophe. Because they understood what Caesar didn't. What most conquerors never grasp. That knowledge is the only thing that can truly die. A human being can be killed, but their children carry them forward. Their influence ripples outward. Their genetic code persists. But a book, a scroll, a singular text containing discoveries made once and never repeated. When that burns, it takes entire possible futures with it. Medical procedures lost meant generations dying of curable diseases. Architectural techniques forgotten meant bridges that could have stood for millennia, never being built. Mathematical proofs destroyed meant theories rediscovered 1,000 years later. 1,000 years of lives that could have been transformed, improved, saved. The library rebuilt itself, slowly, painfully. Scholars donated personal collections. New copies were commissioned. The work continued. But something had changed. There was a tension now, a paranoia that permeated the reading rooms. Scribes made extra copies without authorization. Wealthy patrons began hoarding texts, refusing to loan them. A trust, the fundamental currency of shared knowledge, was corroding, and in the shadows, watching, were those who'd seen what fire could accomplish. How easily the accumulated wisdom of generations could be reduced to carbon and regret. How simple it was to erase ideas you found inconvenient. The question isn't whether the library could survive one disaster. It's whether it could survive becoming a target. 391 CE. 343 years after Caesar's fire, the library has survived, diminished but alive. And then the Christians arrive, not as scholars, as soldiers of God. Emperor Theodosius I issues the decree. Pagan temples must be destroyed. The Serapeum, Alexandria's daughter library, housed in a temple to Serapis, becomes a battlefield. Bishop Theophilus leads the mob. Can you picture it? The particular righteousness in their eyes, the absolute certainty that what they're about to do is holy. They carry torches and hammers, and an ideology that cannot tolerate the existence of alternative truths. The pagan scholars barricade themselves inside. Lay for days, they hold. They can hear the chanting outside, prayers and threats blending into a single murderous hymn. Inside, surrounded by scrolls describing gods the Christians call demons, philosophies they label heresy, scientific observations they deem blasphemy, they wait. One account describes a mathematician named Theon, possibly descended from the earlier Theon who watched Caesar's fire, frantically copying texts by lamplight. His hands shake so badly the ink spatters. His daughter, Hypatia, helps him. Her young face illuminated by flames she doesn't yet know will one day consume her too. They're not trying to save the originals anymore. They know what's coming. They're trying to scatter copies like seeds before the harvest, hoping something, anything, will take root elsewhere before the mob breaks through. The doors shatter. The mob floods in. And here's where the accounts become fragmentary, contradictory, soaked in the particular unreliability that comes when witnesses know they're describing something their civilization will spend centuries trying to justify. Scrolls torn, statues shattered. The statue of Serapis itself, 30 feet of gold and ivory, and ancient authority, dismantled piece by piece while scholars are dragged into the street. Some are beaten. Some convert. Some disappear into the chaos, their fates unknown. Their names lost to the same historical amnesia that swallowed their books. The bishop later writes that they cleansed the temple of demonic influence. No mention of what they burned. No inventory of what was lost. Just the satisfied certainty of ideological purification. But here's what haunts historians. The Christians weren't illiterate barbarians. They ran scriptoriums. They valued certain texts. They preserved what served their purposes, what aligned with their cosmology. What didn't challenge their fundamental assumptions about how reality should be organized. Which means this wasn't random destruction. This was curation through violence. Someone made choices. Standing in that burning temple, surrounded by the accumulated knowledge of centuries, someone decided, consciously, deliberately, what humanity would be allowed to remember, and what it would be forced to forget. Hypatia survived that day. She would continue her father's work, teaching mathematics, astronomy, philosophy. She would become the most renowned scholar in Alexandria. She would attract students from across the empire. And in 415 CE, a Christian mob would drag her from her chariot, strip her naked in the street, and scrape her flesh from her bones using broken pottery and sharpened shells. For the crime of thinking dangerous thoughts, for the sin of knowing too much, her murder wasn't separate from the library's destruction. It was the same impulse, the same ideology that sees knowledge as a threat rather than a treasure. The question isn't whether religious zealots destroyed the library. It's whether anyone is ever truly safe from those who prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. Here's the paradox that eats at every historian who studies this tragedy. The people who destroyed the library also saved parts of it. The same Christian monasteries that burned, pagan, texts spent centuries meticulously copying others. Islamic scholars, who allegedly contributed to the library's final destruction, also translated and preserved Greek manuscripts that would have otherwise been lost forever. The destroyers were also the preservers. The murderers were also the saviors. How do you process that? In the scriptorium of a Coptic monastery, a monk hunches over vellum, his fingers cramped from hours of copying. He's transcribing Aristotle, pagan philosophy that technically conflicts with church doctrine. But his abbot believes some knowledge is worth preserving, even if it's dangerous, even if it challenges faith. The monk adds marginal notes, corrections, commentaries that try to reconcile Aristotelian logic with Christian theology. He's not just copying. He's filtering, deciding what's acceptable, what needs modification, what should be left out entirely. For entire sections go missing. Mathematical proofs that seem too secular. Observations about the natural world that don't align with Genesis. Philosophical arguments that might make young monks question their vows. the preservation is also a kind of destruction. Slow, subtle, almost loving. In Baghdad, centuries later, Islamic scholars do the same thing. They translate Greek texts into Arabic, preserving them through a dark age when Latin Europe has forgotten they ever existed. But they also edit, interpret, make the texts serve Islamic cosmology and philosophy. What reaches us isn't the original. It's the acceptable version. The text that survived because it was deemed safe enough, useful enough, compatible enough with the ideology of whoever held the copying knife. This is the secret horror that academic historians whisper about late at night. We don't know what we've lost because we don't know what was lost. The gaps in ancient knowledge aren't random. They're shaped, sculpted by the hands of those who decided, across centuries, what future generations would be allowed to know. Archimedes' method of mechanical theorems, describing calculus concepts 17 centuries before Newton, survived in a single palimpsest that was scraped clean in the 12th century to write prayers over. We only recovered fragments through modern imaging technology. How many other texts were completely erased? How many revolutionary discoveries were reduced to rumors and fragments? We know the Greeks performed cataract surgery. We know they understood steam power could drive mechanical motion. We know they calculated the Earth's circumference with stunning accuracy. But the detailed methods, the step-by-step procedures that would let us replicate their achievements, they're gone. Not because the knowledge wasn't written down, but because someone, sometime across the centuries of filtering and copying and preservation, decided that particular knowledge wasn't worth preserving, or worse, decided it was too valuable to share. Because here's another possibility that haunts the archives. What if some of the knowledge wasn't destroyed or lost? What if it was hidden, or hoarded by secret societies, private collectors, institutions that realized the power of being the sole possessor of certain truths? What if fragments of the Library of Alexandria still exist, moldering in forgotten vaults, hidden in private collections, deliberately kept from the world? The Vatican Library has over 1 million books. Most have never been digitized. Many are restricted even to scholars. What's in there? The question isn't just what was destroyed. It's what we're still not allowed to know. 642 CE, the Muslim army enters Alexandria. General Amr ibn al-As stands before what remains of the great library, centuries diminished, fire-scarred, but still containing perhaps the largest collection of texts in the known world. He sends a message to Caliph Umar. What should we do with the books? The Caliph's response has echoed through history like a curse. If these books agree with the Quran, they are unnecessary. If they disagree, they are heretical. In either case, burn them. Or, so the story goes, modern historians dispute this account. It appears in no contemporary sources, only showing up centuries later in Christian chronicles that may have been propaganda. Slander, a convenient narrative to blame Islam for what was really centuries of cumulative destruction. But the idea haunts us. The logic of it. That perfectly circular reasoning that makes knowledge itself dangerous when it doesn't conform to ideology. What we know for certain is this. By the mid-7th century, the library as an institution was gone. The Mausoleum, the research center that housed it, was destroyed, likely decades earlier. The daughter library in the Serapeum had been rubble since 391 CE. What remained were scattered private collections, smaller repositories, fragments of former glory, and then silence. No more references to the great library. No more accounts of scholars traveling to Alexandria specifically for its texts. The trail goes cold. Did it burn in a single apocalyptic fire? Or did it simply fade? Scattered across households, neglected as new ideologies valued different kinds of knowledge, left to decay in Egypt's damp climate until the papyrus turned to mulch, and the centuries of accumulated wisdom simply rotted back into the earth. Perhaps that's the most horrifying possibility. Not that it was destroyed dramatically, but that it died slowly from neglect, because fewer and fewer people cared enough to save it. Imagine being the last librarian. Walking through those empty halls, past vacant shelves, past the ghosts of scholars who once filled these rooms with debate and discovery, knowing that the institution you've dedicated your life to is dying. Not from a single catastrophic blow, but from the world's indifference. Because here's the thing about knowledge, it has to be actively maintained, copied, translated, taught to new generations. The moment a society stops valuing certain knowledge, that knowledge begins to die. Not in a year, not in a decade, but across the slow erosion of neglect, as the people who understand it age and die, as the texts that contain it degrade and aren't replaced, as the languages it was written in become incomprehensible to new generations who don't see the point in learning them. This is how civilizations forget. Not through dramatic burnings, but through the quiet choice to stop remembering. And Alexandria wasn't alone. Across the ancient world, libraries were vanishing. The Library of Pergamum, the Imperial Library of Constantinople, countless smaller collections. Each loss made the remaining ones more precious, more vulnerable, more tempting to those who saw in them either treasure or threat. The scholars who witnessed the end, those who packed what they could carry and fled to other cities, other empires, other languages. They carried something beyond just scrolls and parchment. They carried the understanding of how fragile this is, how easily the entire intellectual foundation of a civilization can be reduced to ash and rumor, how important it is to scatter the seeds of knowledge as widely as possible, to make copies, to translate, to teach, to ensure that no single catastrophe can erase what humanity has learned. But also, how powerless they were against those who wanted that erasure. Who do you blame? Caesar, who watched his military tactic consume the waterfront warehouses and barely noted it in his histories. The Christian mobs, who saw pagan knowledge as demonic and made righteousness from its destruction. The Muslim general who may or may not have burned what remained. Or is blame too simple? Too clean? Because the destruction of Alexandria wasn't a single crime committed by a single villain. It was a pattern, repeated across centuries, across ideologies, by people who were absolutely convinced they were doing the right thing. Every destroyer thought they were the hero of their story. Caesar was saving his army. Theophilus was saving souls. Humar, if the story is true, was protecting religious purity. Each believed the knowledge they destroyed was either worthless or dangerous. Each believed that what mattered, military victory, spiritual salvation, theological correctness, was more important than preserving the accumulated wisdom of the past. And they were wrong. But how do you convince someone that abstract knowledge matters more than immediate survival? than eternal salvation, than ideological purity. You can't. Not when they're standing there with the torch in hand, feeling the weight of their certainty, hearing the voice of their God, or their general, or their philosophy telling them, burn it. This is the pathology of civilizational forgetting. Not malice. Certainty. The belief that your truth is so complete, so perfect, that all other truths are unnecessary at best and dangerous at worst. It happens again and again throughout history. The Spanish burning Mayan codices, thousands of texts describing astronomy, medicine, history, reducing an entire civilization's intellectual heritage to 4 surviving books. Works of the devil, the priests called them, as they watched centuries of knowledge turn to ash. The Mongols destroying the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, throwing so many books into the Tigris that witnesses claimed the river ran black with ink for weeks. The Nazis burning, degenerate, books in Berlin, targeting Jewish authors, political dissidents, anyone whose ideas challenged the Reich. The Taliban dynamiting the Buddhas of Bamiyan, erasing cultural memory because it didn't conform to their interpretation of Islam. The pattern is always the same. Ideology encounters knowledge that contradicts or complicates it. Ideology decides knowledge must be wrong. Ideology burns knowledge rather than adjusting beliefs, and the world becomes smaller, dimmer, more uniform in its thinking, because the alternative perspectives, the contradicting data, the uncomfortable truths, they no longer exist. But here's the twist that makes this unbearable. Sometimes the destroyers preserved what they destroyed. In their own texts, their own histories, they'd reference the works they'd burned, quote from them, describe what they contained, just enough to let us know what was lost, but not enough to reconstruct it, taunting future generations with fragments. Here's what existed, they seem to say. Here's what you'll never have. It's not enough to destroy. They had to make sure we knew what we'd lost, that we'd feel the absence, that we'd understand the magnitude of what their certainty had stolen from humanity. Who do you blame? Everyone and no one. The individuals who lit the fires. The systems that made those fires seem justified. The civilizations that valued ideology over knowledge. But also, the scholars who hoarded texts instead of sharing them. The institutions that restricted access to knowledge, making it precious and therefore a target. The societies that allowed literacy to remain the privilege of elites, rather than spreading it wide enough that no single library's destruction could erase what was known. The guilt spreads so wide it becomes meaningless. Or, worse, it becomes a warning that we're still doing this. Still burning books, literally in some places, metaphorically in others. Still deciding what knowledge is dangerous. What ideas should be suppressed, what histories should be forgotten or rewritten. Still building libraries that can burn. Still trusting that someone, somewhere, will preserve what matters. Still believing that knowledge, once created, is somehow permanent. When Alexandria taught us the opposite. That knowledge is the most fragile thing humans have ever created. And we are its only guardians. The question isn't who destroyed the Library of Alexandria. It's whether we've learned anything from watching it burn. Let me tell you what burned. Not the statistics. 700,000 scrolls, we say, though no one knows if that number is accurate or propaganda or desperate hope. Let me tell you what was in those scrolls. the complete works of Sophocles. We have 7 of his plays. He wrote 123. The other 116. Lost. A comedy and tragedy and philosophical depth that shaped Greek thought for centuries. Smoke, Archimedes' lost treatises. We know he came close to inventing calculus. We know he understood infinity better than anyone would for nearly 2 millennia. We have fragments. Palimpsest scraped clean. His Stomachion, possibly the first mathematical understanding of combinatorics, survived in a single, partially erased copy. What else did he discover that we'll never know? Medical texts from Herophilos and Erasistratus, the first physicians to systematically dissect human corpses, to map the nervous system, to understand the difference between arteries and veins, to perform brain surgery with success rates we wouldn't match until the 19th century. Their methods gone. For 1,000 years after Alexandria fell, medieval surgeons avoided opening the skull. They'd lost the knowledge that it was possible, safe, sometimes necessary. People died of treatable brain trauma because the texts that explained how to save them were ash. That's not abstract loss. That's corpses. Specific human beings whose names we don't know, who died in pain across the medieval period because the knowledge that could have saved them burned in Alexandria. Maps showing lands that wouldn't be discovered by Europe for another 1,000 years. Trade routes to places that became myth. Eratosthenes' complete geography. He calculated Earth's circumference to within 2% accuracy using shadows and geometry. We have his method. But his detailed maps, his observations of coastlines and rivers and mountain ranges, lost. And then the strange ones. The texts we only know existed because someone mentioned them in passing. A scroll describing animated statues, created by Hellenistic engineers, potentially sophisticated automata or clockwork mechanisms, references to Greek fire and other chemical weapons whose formulas were lost. Ctesibius's works on hydraulics and pneumatics. He invented the force pump, the water organ, possibly even rudimentary steam engines. How close did they come to an industrial revolution? We'll never know. But here's the truly disturbing part. Some scholars argue that's not the worst of what was lost. That the real tragedy isn't the specific texts. It's the methodology. The culture of systematic inquiry. The networks of scholars sharing discoveries. The infrastructure of knowledge creation and preservation. When the library burned, it didn't just destroy books. It destroyed the system that created those books. It broke the chain of intellectual transmission. It scattered the communities of scholars. It convinced future generations that preserving knowledge wasn't worth the investment, because it would just burn anyway. For 1,000 years, Europe's Dark Ages, though the name is unfair and Eurocentric, the very idea that knowledge should be systematically collected, tested, expanded upon, that idea almost died. It survived in fragments, in monastery scriptoriums, in Islamic scholarship, in Chinese and Indian intellectual traditions that were never dependent on Alexandria. But the method, that specifically Greek approach of empirical observation, combined with logical deduction, combined with mathematical rigor, it went dormant. And when it was rediscovered during the Renaissance, when Europeans started translating Arabic translations of Greek texts and realized what they'd lost, the grief was palpable. Renaissance scholars write like they're mourning, describing the lost works in terms usually reserved for dead loved ones. If only we had Aristotle's dialogues. Oh, what wouldn't I give for 1 hour with Archimedes, complete works? They knew they were living in the shadow of giants. They knew they were rebuilding from ruins. They knew that their ancestors had possessed knowledge they were only beginning to reclaim. And that's perhaps the cruelest legacy: the awareness of loss. If the ancient knowledge had been completely forgotten, if no one knew it existed, maybe we could live in ignorance without pain. But instead we have fragments, references, tantalizing hints. We know what we're missing. We can calculate the gaps. We spend careers trying to reconstruct lost works from scattered quotations in other texts, like archaeologists assembling a skeleton from 3 teeth and a femur. The Library of Alexandria didn't just burn. It created an absence. A hole in human history shaped exactly like the knowledge we lost. And we've been trying to fill it ever since. The library is still burning. Right now, in this moment, somewhere in the world, knowledge is being lost. Not to dramatic fires, but to link rot, to format obsolescence, to failing hard drives and discontinued servers, to paywalls that lock research behind corporate gatekeepers, to languages dying with their last speakers, taking oral traditions no one thought to record. To the simple, devastating fact that maintaining knowledge requires constant, active effort. And we're not doing enough. The Internet Archive fights constant legal battles just to preserve websites and texts. Indigenous knowledge systems vanish as elders die and young people assimilate. Scientific papers published in now, defunct journals become inaccessible. Video games, movies, music, entire media formats become unplayable as the hardware to access them disappears. We have more knowledge than any previous civilization, and we're losing it faster than ever before. Because here's what Alexandria teaches us: it's not enough to create knowledge. You have to actively protect it, copy it, distribute it, ensure it exists in multiple formats, multiple locations, multiple languages. You have to make it anti-fragile, resistant to the next Caesar, the next ideological mob, the next format change, the next shift in what society values and funds and considers worth saving. And we're not. We're building digital Alexandrias, massive centralized repositories of knowledge, and assuming they'll last forever because they're the cloud. As if clouds don't evaporate. As if corporations don't go bankrupt. As if governments don't decide certain knowledge is dangerous and should be suppressed. The scholars of Alexandria thought their library would last forever too. They were wrong. But here's the strange, terrible hope. Because Alexandria burned, we learned. The loss was so catastrophic, so well documented, so mourned, that it became a warning. Don't put all your knowledge in one place. Make copies. Distribute widely. The value preservation as much as creation. Treat knowledge as the fragile, precious, desperately important thing it is. The printing press was invented partly in response to Alexandria's ghost. The understanding that hand-copied manuscripts were too vulnerable, too few, too easily lost. Modern scientific publishing, for all its flaws, exists because researchers understood that knowledge has to be shared, replicated, independently verified. The Internet itself is architecturally distributed partly because of lessons learned from centralized knowledge systems that became single points of failure. Alexandria's destruction taught us how knowledge dies. And in that terrible lesson, we learned how to make it survive. But the fight isn't over. It's never over. Every generation faces its own version of the choice: preserve or burn, share or hoard, protect knowledge or sacrifice it to ideology, convenience, profit, fear. And every generation gets it partly wrong. The scholars who tried to save Alexandria in its final days, frantically copying texts, hiding scrolls, sending duplicates to other cities, they were fighting a battle they knew they'd lose. But they fought anyway, because they understood something fundamental. That knowledge is how humans transcend their individual mortality. It's how we build on what came before, rather than starting from zero with every new generation. It's how we avoid repeating the same mistakes, the same tragedies, the same preventable suffering. It's how we prove that consciousness matters, that thinking and questioning and discovering is worth the effort, that the universe can be understood, and that understanding is humanity's highest calling. When the library burned, it took specific texts, but it also took something harder to quantify. It took the confidence that knowledge could be trusted to endure. It took the belief that the past could reliably inform the future. It took the certainty that someone, somewhere, would preserve what mattered. And we've been trying to rebuild that trust ever since. Late at night, in libraries around the world, there are people working to preserve things. Digitizing old books, recording endangered languages, archiving websites, backing up scientific data, fighting legal battles to keep information free. They're the descendants of those Alexandria scribes. Knowing the fight is endless, the enemy is entropy itself. The odds are impossible, and doing it anyway, because the alternative is unthinkable. Key to let knowledge die. To let the questions go unanswered. To let future generations live in darkness because we couldn't be bothered to maintain the lights. Alexandria burned. But the library itself, as an idea, as a commitment to preserving human knowledge, that survived. In every library, every archive, every museum, every university, every server farm quietly backing up data, every researcher making their work open access, every teacher passing knowledge to the next generation. Alexandria lives. Not as a building, but as a promise. That what we learn matters enough to protect. That the questions we ask outlive us. That knowledge, once created, becomes a sacred trust, to be guarded against the firers. All the firers. The literal ones. The ideological ones. The fires of neglect and indifference, and the slow entropy that reduces everything to dust and silence. The Library of Alexandria is still burning. And we're still trying to save it. The only question. The question that haunts every scholar, every librarian, every person who believes knowledge matters, is whether we'll succeed. Or whether, centuries from now, some future civilization will look back at our lost databases and extinct websites and DRM, locked media and vanished scientific papers, and wonder what we knew that they'll never discover. The ghost of Alexandria watches, waiting to see if we've learned its lesson. Therefore, if we're doomed to burn it all again.